Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. This is a Saturday morning, and a couple of weeks ago, I was up in Salmon, Idaho, and traveling around the valley and having memories of certain areas in the valley. You know how that is when you go back home or you go to the place that you spent a lot of time growing up. For some reason, those areas bring back some of the memories, some of the haunts, if you will, of the places that we grew up and the people we knew and the experiences we had. And it's kind of fun, for me anyway, to record some of those memories and experiences. And it kind of goes along with the theme of this Growing Up in Idaho program that I started a couple of years ago. And it's fun to reminisce. And I hope you don't mind if my words don't come out flowing exactly right. It's because I'm getting older. My brain doesn't work as quickly as it used to. But the thoughts are still there, the memories, and the things I'm going to talk about. So I stopped by the Salmon Airport, one of my little places, and did a short video cast of some of the quick memories I had of that area. And I got to thinking about it, and all of the experiences I had working at the Salmon Airport for Salmon Air Taxi, starting in about 1980 when Richard Disney showed up on the scene and bought out Carol Jarvis. He used to be in our family, as I mentioned, and my dad was highly influenced by Carol. And it's my understanding he used to work for him years ago and spent a lot of time around him. And Dad always mentions the things that he's learned from Carol and kind of passed those memories on. So to set the scene, back in 1980 when I started working there, the Salmon Airport wasn't as busy as it appears now. A lot of the hangars that are sitting on the ground now weren't there when I was there, and things look a little more bright and cheery. There's more pavement on the ground, for example. And I imagine the runway is probably upgraded. And the pumps and a lot of the other things that I have strong memories of. So what happened was, in about the fall of 1980, actually, it was the spring of 1980, I'm sorry. I was walking out of school. School got over. I was headed home. And my dad popped out of his office. As you may know, he was the high school principal in those days. He popped out of his office and said, "Hey, Jeff, I just got a call from this guy named Richard Disney. He's an out-of-stater who just bought Salmon Air Taxi, and he's wondering if there's any kids in school that I might know of that want to have a job working for him at the airport." And he said, "I know that you already have a job working there in Safeways for Jim Bills, but you might want to try something different. I'm just letting you know." So as I got in my car, I was thinking, it wouldn't be a bad idea to try something new. It might be fun to do something different. So as I was driving home, the airport's on the way, and I just turned off there and thought maybe I'll go and introduce myself to this Disney guy. And I couldn't think of the name Disney without thinking of Disneyland and Disney World and all the Disney movies. And I wondered in my mind if this Disney character was anything like the Disney we know and love. who created all the entertainment for us. Anyway, it's just one of those side thoughts that that still sticks in my mind. So I pulled up there, and this big guy with curly hair, kind of a big chubby head, kind of the head of the size of a basketball, was sitting on a rocking chair out in front of the old Salmon Air Taxi office. Now, I knew that was the office because Dad and I stopped in and visited Carol Jarvis a few times. In fact, we stopped in one day when he was building some of the counters that sat in that office as you walk in the door. So I got out of my car and walked up and said, "Hey, I'm Jeff Hicks, and I understand you called the school today and wondered if anybody wanted to work for you here at the airport." I said, "I'm interested, and I'd like to know what you have and what kind of situation you might have here." And so he introduced himself. He was a really nice guy, and kind of had a high-pitched voice, which stuck in my mind. And he just explained that he just bought the air taxi and was excited to get going in the service and help the community of Salmon and the people in their transportation needs. And one of the things that he mentioned that stuck in my mind and is still there because it's kind of a point of management style. He said, if you come to work for me, you're going to have a lot of autonomy. I don't have time to follow you around and make sure you're doing everything I ask. So I need someone that can be trusted, that can work by themselves and do a good job, and just kind of work off of the program of objectives. I'll tell you what I need to have done, and you just do it. And I like that. I thought, well, that's something I think I could do well at. I'm trustworthy, and I've been trusted for years as a kid to get things done by my dad and others, and I think I can do a good job for you. And I was 15 years old at the time. And so we visited for a minute, and he asked if I could show up the next day and get to work. And I said, absolutely. The pay was about right. And I was excited. So the next day I showed up and he said, okay, what we want to do here, first of all, is that hangar over there, the shop, the mechanic shop, and the little office next to it. They need to be painted and cleaned up. That little office is full of storage stuff. And I'd like you to paint the outside of the hangar and make it look better. It's kind of ratty looking. And it was. At that time, it seemed like there was a lot of corrugated tin that was, the paint had faded on and things were looking kind of ratty. And there were a few weeds growing up in and around the building, and he wanted those cleared out. So I walked over and opened the door to this little office area just west of the shop that was attached to the building, and sure enough, it was clear full of junk. And it was expensive junk. You know how that is. Stuff that people don't want to throw away because it's good, but they haven't used it in 10 years. And Disney gave me the choice of deciding what was junk and what was not, and just hauling it to the dump. And that was a lot of responsibility. I didn't know if he wanted something, but here's the secret. I grew up with a father that had this little thing called the law of salvage. And just quickly, what that law was anything you found along the roadways, the highways, freeways, and sitting in empty lots, abandoned places, anything useful that you find that doesn't belong to somebody. You can't go stealing people's stuff, but anything useful you find that's not claimed by anyone, you can take and clean up and use. And you should. It was kind of like a law of humanity for my dad. You got to keep these things going, the useful things that other people have discarded. So anyway, this was this little office area was clear full of stuff that Dad would have been tickled over in his law of salvage. So I sorted through it, and stuff that was obvious junk that wouldn't even fit into my own law of salvage, I threw in a pile and figured I'd haul that to the dump. And the other stuff I found storage places for. And I got that area cleaned up. And then I went and found some paint and got to work on the outside of the hangar. And this was all going on through the first week. I wasn't able to get all that done in the first day, obviously, especially just working after school. I got the hangar and the office area cleaned up. And then Disney said, okay, it's time for me to check you out on the pumps. And I thought, oh, this is going to be fun. This must be, he's acting like this is kind of a big deal. So I wonder what's going on here. It was nothing really big. But as you can imagine, the fuel pumps for an airport are an area you want to have clean. You don't want dirt and water in the gas, in the storage tanks. And so Disney taught me how to check the level of the tanks. We had this long dipstick that was about 15 feet long, and I'd poke it down in the storage tanks that were buried in the ground there by the pumps and measure the amount of fuel in those tanks. And then the second part of the process was to do a fuel cleanliness check. I'd take a little glass bottle and fill it full of fuel and check how it looked, if it looked like there was water in it, if it was discolored, if there was any dirt in it. Then I would note that in my little record book. And that was how we checked the fuel there. Kind of an easy process. And then the second thing was Disney wanted me to maintain the runway area. And there was a little tractor in a brush mowing deck in this hangar right next to the pumps. And that hangar, incidentally, was either owned or used by Norm Guth. And I'd been in there before. Norm was a friend of the family and a great guy. And he had his plane stored in there, so I was always careful about driving the tractor out and not dinging Norm's plane up. That would have been horrible. Something I thought about that would have horrified me if I dinged somebody's property. Anyway, I would mow the runway frequently to keep it nice, groomed, and clean. And I enjoyed that. And a few times when I was out there on the tractor, planes would come in and land a few feet away from me, and that was kind of an interesting experience, at least the first time. And kind of scared and startled me, especially since I was heading north and the plane was landing the same direction, and I didn't see it until it was right on me, basically. Scared the daylights out of me. And I think the pilot knew that and got a chuckle out of it. Anyway, one of the things that I had to do there that first little while was Disney said, hey, Jeff, the lights on the runway have not worked for a long time. I don't know what's wrong with them. Maybe you could go out there and see if you could figure it out. So I said, all right. I headed out and found the breaker box for the lights, and everything looked fine there. And I walked out toward the runway and noticed there was no problem that I could see. And then on my way back, I recognized that someone had done a little bit of digging. Probably some construction guys had done some digging between the area where the breaker box was and the runway. And I thought the dolts who did this work here probably cut the wire to the lights. Seemed like something at least I ought to investigate. So sure enough, I grabbed a shovel and dug around there and found the heavy-duty electric cable that went to the runway lights, and sure enough, it had been cut in two. And so I got some wire nuts from the mechanics and some black tape and a little bit of some conduit, and went out there and fixed that wiring. And what was great, as you know, anybody who's done a do-it-yourself project, especially when it comes to electricity, when you get it all done and you go back to the breaker box and flip that breaker switch and everything lights up, it was just like Christmas time. It was delightful. And I was happy that the lights were now working, and Disney thought it was fantastic too, and he congratulated me on fixing that because he hadn't been able to do it, didn't have time to do it, and so now it's working. And, you know, if you're a pilot needing to land after the sun's gone down, those lights come in really handy, as you can imagine. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was some of the people that I worked with. The most colorful character by far that I had anything to do with, and the person that I spent the most time with, was this mechanic named Larry. I mentioned his name in my little video cast. Let me describe Larry. First of all, I thought he was one of the greatest guys I'd met. He's helpful. He was kind. He was not afraid to let me get involved in what he was doing in the mechanic part of things. And he taught me a lot. He was always teaching. And that's kind of a thing about a person that I've always admired. Someone who's a teacher and isn't afraid of giving that information to other people, especially to a kid who's wanting to learn. And Larry seemed to be happy to do that for me, and I appreciated that. So Larry, to get the picture of Larry, he appeared to be a throwback from the hippie generation in the 60s and early 70s. He always had a Levi jacket on, an old t-shirt, Levi pants, and his hair was long, kind of scraggly. In my generation, he was just known as a regular old typical hippie. And like a lot of the hippies back then, he was kind and easygoing, probably because he used marijuana once in a while. You know, I don't know what your thoughts on people who smoke marijuana and use it, but they're usually pretty easygoing people. And Larry was that way. And when he spoke, you know, like you would expect, he kind of drew out his vowels, kind of had that drawl in his voice. And he used the word man a lot. Hey, man, good to see you today. Anyway, I liked Larry. He's such a good guy. And another person that I worked with that I admired and thought the world of was the head pilot. His name was Dick Williams, and he introduced himself a few days after I started working for Disney. He walked up when I was doing something and introduced himself, said, "Hey, I'm the guy who they consider the head pilot here, and it's nice to get to know you," and we visited for a few minutes. And I don't think Dick knew it at the time, and I think I mentioned it to him. I don't recall, but I had flown with Dick before. My dad worked for Western Rivers Expeditions, a boat company in Salmon, in the summer times. And he started in about 72, 73, sometime in that area. And one day I went with Dad to the airport to unload some boats that were going to be flown into Indian Creek, the put-in spot for one of the for the Middle Fork of Salmon River. And Dick was going to fly in. As I recall, he was flying an old yellow World War II era Otter, big old airplane, single engine, and good cargo plane. And he asked if Dad and I wanted to fly back there with him. And he had some extra space. And Dad said, sure, yeah, sounds like fun. So I was, at that time, 9 or 10 years old. And it made a huge impact on me because, first of all, I had never flown back into that area of Idaho. And it was beautiful. We flew over the crags, the Bighorn Crags. And landed there at Indian Creek. And then from there, we had to go onto the Chamberlain Basin and drop off some cargo. And that experience was just a lot of fun. And on the way back, I got invited to sit up in the right seat there and in the cockpit. And so I was able to observe Dick and his expert ability to fly an airplane. And, of course, I didn't know anything about flying, but I could tell that this guy was smooth. Things that he did, his actions, his movements in piloting that plane seemed to be precise and right on to me. We had a smooth landing in that backcountry strip in both areas. And I could just tell he knew what he was doing. He was a good pilot. So anyway, I met Dick Williams. And there, that first week that I was working for Disney, and thought, this is going to be a good experience. I'm going to learn from a lot of great people. So after taking care of that hangar, the shop and the mechanics hangar, I was told to my next big project would be to strip the paint off of a couple of the planes that we had there on our line. And as you might know, paint weighs quite a bit. And so the paint on the outside of an airplane adds quite a bit of weight to it. And Disney wanted to dump some of that weight and just use a stripped down plane. And so my job was to get the paint off and then buff that aluminum into a high shine. It was kind of a fun job, but filthy, dirty, especially the buffing part. But I got that done, and Disney seemed to be delighted with my work. And he was kind of a scientific kind of guy. And he came out and explained all of the details of dumping the weight from the paint and how it would make the plane fly better without that weight, and be able to glide through the air with nothing but the bare aluminum. Anyway, I thought it sounded reasonable to me, and I was happy to make him happy and help him out there. And the planes looked good. They kind of had that stainless steel look, shiny. It was kind of neat. One of the interesting things about working around mechanics that I didn't know, but I learned quickly, especially a mechanic that was a professional, that was an artist, I guess you would say, at his craft. And I think that's a good description of Larry. He was an artist when it came to his mechanic work. He wanted to make sure that things were done precisely the way they should be done. And, of course, that's what you would want with a mechanic working on your airplane. If you're going to be flying around in the air, you don't want it dropping out of the sky, because the mechanic was negligent in doing some work on the plane. Anyway, that's one thing I noticed with Larry. And when I helped him, which I did almost every day, he made sure that I did things correctly. And one of the first things he did was he said, okay, Jeff, when you go out there and gas those planes up, make sure that you get the caps, the fuel caps, back on the tanks correctly and snugly. You don't want those, he'd be like, hey man, you don't want those fuel caps flipping off when the planes are in the air. That gas will siphon right out, man. And then what are you going to do? That plane will go right into the ground if there's no gas keeping the motor running. Yeah, man. And so I got the message and a lot of other things. One of the things that he mentioned was a housekeeping thing. When you're up there on a step ladder putting fuel in the airplane, make sure that your belt buckle and other things that you might be wearing are not rubbing up against the wing of the plane. It'll scratch the paint. Hey, man, make sure you don't scratch the paint on that plane. So anyway, I got the message, and it was always good. And for that reason, I liked Larry. I thought he was a great guy, and he was helpful. And I remember one time I was out working and changing the oil in one of the planes, and he came out. He said, "Hey, Jeff, how you doing, man?" I said, "I'm doing pretty good, Larry. What's going on?" He says, "I got to show you something. Walk with me." We went over. We had this guy drop in that needed some work, and he claimed to be a really good mechanic and knew all there was to know about aircraft and airframes and all the things that you would need for a good mechanic. And he said, Larry said, "Come with me and check this guy's work out." We went out to this one of Disney's planes, and this new mechanic was supposed to be doing a rivet job on the wing of one of these planes. And Larry said, "Hey, man, look at that job. That guy did that rivet job with a ball-peen hammer. Doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Makes me kind of mad." And sure enough, if you've ever read Mad Magazine, the stuff that Alfred E. Newman would do, the bang-up jobs he would do, depicted in that magazine, that's kind of what I was looking at with this rivet job of this new mechanic. It wasn't good. Looked like a little kid had done it. And it upset Larry. And so he took that opportunity to teach me how to do correct riveting, how to make it look nice, and how to do a professional job. Kind of made me wonder why he didn't grab that mechanic and teach him how. Maybe he did when I wasn't around. I don't know. But that mechanic didn't last long for Disney. I think he was, one of those people that drifted in and worked for a couple of weeks and then drifted back out. Nobody knew where he came from and where he went after he left. But like I said, like I mentioned, it's that expectation was that I would be very professional in all of my work and not leave a job half done or looking half-assed like that rivet job. And another thing that I did in helping Larry and the other mechanics was often the pressure needs to be checked in the cylinder heads on those aircraft motors. And so I'd go in the shop there, and my job usually was to twist the prop when they were checking the pressure. And then they would mark it down in their little record books and go on to the next cylinder. And, standing there twisting the prop was an opportunity to ask questions and to learn more. And it seemed like Larry and the other mechanic, a guy named Jim, were always really helpful, and I appreciated that. One time, we got a new pilot, and it was not long after we picked up a brand new, really fancy, nice 207 turbo Cessna that Disney picked up from somewhere. This new pilot flew into, I think it was Indian Creek, dumping some boats off. And the sun was in his eyes when he was landing, and he hit the tops of a tree going in on his approach and busted the left wing on this brand new Cessna. And, that's kind of a critical incident. And, if the plane can't fly, you got to leave it there. And thankfully, he didn't crash and wreck the plane and destroy it. But he took the chance and said, I think I can fly this plane out. And he did, that new pilot. He was a good pilot. And I don't recall his name, but he definitely busted a hole in that wing, right on the leading edge. And so when he landed, he radioed ahead and said, hey, this is what I've done. Got some problems, but I'm able to fly, and I'll be landing soon. You may want to have somebody come out and help me with things. Larry and all the others, we're going to need to get this wing off and get it fixed. And, the way I found out about this was Disney came out to where I was working, and he was pacing and had this worried, kind of almost angry look on his face. And he explained what happened. And it was kind of funny because Disney looked mad, looked anxious, but the tone on his voice was completely calm and cool. And I thought, that's an interesting anomaly that I've never seen in anyone before. But anyway, that plane landed. The pilot got out and explained, what had happened, and everybody was kind of standing around, wringing their hands, shaking their heads. First of all, happy that he didn't crash the plane and hurt himself or anyone else. And second of all, that he was able to fly that plane out, and we didn't have to go in and do any mechanic work, in the backcountry. So we went to work immediately. We got some stools and stood up, and it was at that moment that I learned that a plane is held on by only a few long steel pins that screw into the fuselage. So we took those pins out, and the wing dropped, and we wrapped that thing in bubble wrap. And one of our guys stuck it in one of our little cargo planes and flew it up to Seattle that very day, and where they would fix it up there and send it back within a few weeks. So anyway, that was a learning experience. Another time, Disney flew in from a cargo trip to, I believe, Boise. And he flew in, landed, and stopped out by the pumps. And he walked over and said, "Hey, Jeff, I've got some cargo here. I wonder if you could help me unload." So I said, "Sure, yeah." I went over there, and the two of us unloaded that plane. And right on top of the cargo he was hauling was this thing wrapped up in a couple of sheets and a blanket. And he said, "I was down there, and this family called me and asked if I would fly their mother home, who had died a few days ago." And I said, "Sure. I don't have any, I'm going to be hauling cargo. And if you don't mind me putting her in with the cargo, it's just fine. It's not like she's going to be getting a ride in a hearse where it's all formal and nice." And the family seemed to think that was okay. And so this little deceased lady, wrapped in a sheet and a blanket, was put on top of the cargo and landed there in Salmon. And we unloaded her, and I had the ankles, and he had her upper portion, and we gently and carefully and respectfully took this little lady and stuck her in the hearse that had pulled up to take her into town and get her taken care of. And I just thought that was the strangest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Don't know who it was, didn't really want to know. But anyway, sometimes we just have to get things done, right? And that's the way it works. Probably the most horrible experience I had working at Salmon Air Taxi was this day that one of the planes went down. We had a relatively new pilot. It wasn't the same pilot that that wrecked the brand new 207 Cessna. It was a different guy. It was a young guy. And I don't really remember all of the exact details, but I do remember that as I recall, the story went that he got into the canyon, heading up over the mountain, the pass there at Williams Creek, and wasn't high enough. He didn't have enough altitude, and when he realized that, he tried to bank and do a turn there in the canyon, and his load shifted, and he went right into the ground. And his plane caught fire, and he died in that crash. And that was horrible, to have something like that happen. I had worked on that plane. I knew every inch of that plane, and I knew the pilot. He was a great guy, not too much older than I was. And it was a horrible experience to have that happen, and something I'll never forget. They took that airplane and loaded the charred, burned up, half-melted pieces and hauled them in and put them out there just on the west side of the office, the hangar. And that's where it laid until the scrap people came and took it away. And I always looked at that as bad luck. I wish they wouldn't have put that wrecked plane there, but I don't know where else they would have put it. So anyway, that was just one of those unfortunate things that always sticks in my mind and kind of gives me a sick feeling every time I think about. But it was always, working at Salmon Air Taxi was always an interesting time. It was an interesting thing to do, and I really enjoyed it for the most part. So back in the day, those couple of years that I worked at the air taxi, I was driving a 67 Chevelle Super Sport in those days. I bought that car from Richard Putnam, and everyone had a muscle car in those. And it seemed like, there were so many of those various types of cars, and I loved my car. Just the look and feel. It just had that feel. And it was a 67, and this was 80, 81. And so it had a little over a decade of age. And but I'd start that car up and it sounded like a race car, and it had dual exhaust and those thrush mufflers and headers and everything to increase the horsepower. And that 396 engine was hard to discount too, right? And but one day I pulled in there at the airport, and I was talking to Larry, the mechanic, and I had this idea that maybe running some 100-octane avgas in that car would clean it out, and I'd be able to increase my power a little bit. You're always thinking about going faster and getting those top speeds up quickly, right? For those of you who remember those days. And Larry's like, yeah, man, put some 100-octane in there. What could it hurt? Might burn your valves a little bit, but if it does, I can help you fix that problem. Anyway, so I filled that car up with 100-octane, and yeah, it cleaned things out. Burned really clean. And I don't know if it burned the valves at all. I didn't worry too much about that. The car ran pretty well as it ever did after I filled it up. But for those of you who drove those muscle cars back in those days, you're constantly having to adjust your carburetor and other things, checking your points, and making sure that everything's, adjusted so that you get the right air-fuel mixture and your engine's not bogging down, chugging. And anyway, that seemed to be the trick. And I had quite a few individuals come out and with their vehicles and their fancy motorcycles, and put that 100-octane gas in, just so that they could clean out their system and make things work better. And it was, I guess, not a bad idea. So the last thing I want to talk about, I don't remember exactly what year it was. It was probably about 81. And Richard Disney and his wife and his little kid had left to go on a trip. And while they were gone, something happened there at the office, and the place caught on fire and burnt down. And if you look in the newspapers, you'll probably find a picture of the scene. The newspaper folks came out and took a picture of the fire and in that office burning. And everything that was in there got destroyed. And the cars that were parked out in front of the office were also, the paint was burned back on them, and it created a heck of a mess. And one of my jobs after that fire was to pull the columns, the steering columns out of those vehicles so that they could be sent off to the factory and get new keys made. There was a couple of them that parked there, the air taxi vehicles, and the keys were in the office that burned up, and all those things were melted and gone, destroyed. So I pulled the steering columns out of those cars, sent them off, and we got new keys made and then installed them when the columns came back. It's kind of an interesting thing back in those days. I don't know why there weren't any locksmiths in Salmon that could help out there, or any of the dealerships that could help out. I guess it wasn't a thing. Anyway, another thing that I thought was fascinating was, and kind of interesting because I'd really never seen this before, but about almost every Saturday, maybe every other Saturday after the work was done, somebody would show up with a case of beer there at work, and everybody would sit around in Disney's yard and visit and talk about the activities of the week and just mingle and and as friends and family. And I never drank in those days. I was a teenager and didn't drink beer. And so Disney was always good about making sure I had some Coke or Pepsi or something to drink. Of course, back in those days, I was Mellow Yellow was my favorite pop. Mountain Dew hadn't come along yet. At least I hadn't found it, but Mellow Yellow was the best pop on the market. But anyway, that's beside the point. We would sit around and visit, and everybody'd be drinking their beer, and I'd be drinking my Pepsi. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating and that I felt bad about, kind of, was Disney's had this little kid named Nick. He was about 2.5 or 3 years old. Little kid, barely talking. He'd toddle around and was kind of a cute little character, say and do funny things like you would expect a little kid to do. But during those beer parties, he would go over and grab his own beer. Little 2.5 or 3-year-old kid. And Disney's would crack it open for him and give it back to him, and he would walk around drinking his own beer. I'd never seen that kind of thing in my life. And but anyway, I always thought it was kind of a sad commentary to see that tiny little kid walking around drinking beer. That's all I really have to talk about with my experiences there at Salmon Air Taxi. Like I mentioned, it was a great experience working for Richard Disney and working alongside Larry and the other guys. Thanks for listening. Growing up in Idaho, the good old days.